We came,
we
we saw,
he
died.
Such were Hillary Clinton's ominous words following Gaddafi's startling assassination. It has been more than a decade now since NATO effectively bombed Libya to oblivion, and in the process executing Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in October 2011. Once labeled the mad dog of the Middle East by US President Ronald Reagan, Gaddafi was loved and hated in almost equal measure. On the one hand, the West labeled him a terrorist and a murderous rogue. This effectively made Libya an international pariah, condemning millions of Libyans to starvation, death, destruction, and homelessness. In addition to Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, Libya was added to the so-called Axis of Evil, a term commonly associated with President Bush. On the other hand though, Muammar al-Gaddafi was popular among Libyans, and in extension, most Africans. At a time when African countries were dealing with the shackles of colonization and neo-colonialism, Gaddafi was seen as a beacon of hope for a united Africa. In his speeches, Gaddafi often outlined his plan to create a new united Africa with its own currency, an army to defend the continent, and a single passport. Besides, he had the gold and oil reserves to back it up. But by far the biggest threat to US interests in Africa was the gold dinar. The gold dinar was a proposed gold currency that Gaddafi believed would free Africa from the shackles of the global economic system and imperialist exploitation. This would be a common African currency backed by gold, which would effectively replace the USD for trade in the African continent. The greenback gives the USA unparalleled power in world trade. Central banks hold about 60% of their foreign exchange in dollars, but some nations, particularly those in the BRICS bloc, are working on minimizing the USD's hegemony. See, the USD is backed by nothing, and the US Fed, which is the US Federal Reserve, is the only institution that reserves the right to control the printing of the dollar, straight from thin air. Fundamentally, the US Fed mints the dollars, exports them, and in return gets Africa's rich resources practically for free. Gaddafi's gold dinar would have effectively undermined the West's presence in Africa and beyond. Gaddafi planned to accomplish this money coup by 2023, but some insidious forces in the West were lurking in the shadows. Libya's ongoing destruction belongs to Hillary Clinton more than anyone else. Being the Secretary of the State at the time, she swayed President Barack Obama to launch a version of the real-life Game of Thrones. A substantial body of evidence shows that the intelligence that informed the military bombing decision was not credible in the first place. It is largely agreed by scholars that Libya was destroyed for two reasons. One, the nation had the strongest voices opposing the expansion of NATO and US military power onto the continent due to Africa's vast human and natural resources. Two, Colonel Gaddafi refused to open up Libya to foreign investments, or in other words, external influence by the imperialists, which is largely made up of NATO's main members. Significant oil reserves had been discovered in Libya in the late 1950s, but the extraction was controlled by foreign petroleum companies, which set prices to the advantage of Western consumers and who benefited from a majority of the revenue. This had to change. By the way, NATO is a short version of North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a military alliance that was established by the Washington Treaty of 1949, which sought to create a counterweight to the Soviet Union, which was the other world power at the time. NATO members include the UK, the USA, France, and 28 more EU nations. The more disturbing bit is that NATO is not a signatory to the UN Charter, which effectively makes the invasion illegal and an out-of-boundary operation. So what do the different factions think of Gaddafi's leadership? Under his stewardship, Libya was so unprecedented growth, with illiteracy rates, gender rights, and healthcare improving significantly. Despite being a darling of most African nations, a record of human rights abuses and corruption in his own country turned many Libyans against Gaddafi. Despite many seeing him as a Pan-African, Gaddafi was also accused of backing notorious rebel groups in Liberia and Sierra Leone, among others. More so, he was viewed as a threat to some African regimes. No wonder the African Union was stuck in the horns of dilemma and looked on without a whimper of protest in 2011. In the aftermath of the Libya bombings, thousands were killed, displaced, and many fled to the neighboring Tunisia. Gaddafi was not without his supporters though. Under Gaddafi, prosperity was evident in Libya. Libyans enjoyed notable economic benefits such as free education and high-quality medical care. Water and electricity was stable and completely free during Muammar Gaddafi's final years as the president. Libya also had a substantial reserves of gold. The nation's per capita income grew to over $11,000, which was one of the highest in Africa. He also built the Great Man-Made River, or GMR in short. This was a vast network of underground pipelines and aqueducts, bringing high-quality fresh water from ancient underground aquifers deep in the Sahara to the coast of Libya for domestic use, agriculture, and industry. The GMR had been described as the largest irrigation project in the world and was added to the Guinness Book of Records. Libyans like to call it the Great Man-Made River or the Eighth Wonder of the World. Well, this was the first of the many Libyan projects that NATO consciously bombed to smithereens. Such is the cost of America's promiscuous war-making in Africa, Asia, Latin America, even in Europe, as we see today in the Ukraine-Russian war of attrition. All this bloodshed was disguised in the name of democracy and protection of civilians. Now let's briefly dive into the history of Gaddafi and Libya right before the 2011 bombings. Muammar al-Gaddafi met a gruesome end in October 2011 during the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was a series of civilian revolts that started in Tunisia and Egypt, then spread across the Maghreb and the Arab world. So what exactly led to Gaddafi's ouster, and why was he assassinated? Bad blood between NATO and Gaddafi began way back, after effectively taking power from King Idris I in a bloodless coup d'etat. Muammar Gaddafi became the de facto leader of Libya on 1st September 1969. Almost immediately, Gaddafi effectively removed all US and British military bases from Libya in 1970, and this was just the beginning of a growing conflict with the conceptual West. One critical event of the 1970s was the burning of the US Embassy in Libya. Mobs attacked and set fire to the US Embassy in Tripoli. Embassy officials were subsequently withdrawn and the embassy shut down. He was now walking on nails as US spies was on his heels. Gaddafi spent most of the 80s and 90s resisting the USA and NATO. For instance, in the late 70s and 80s, Libya gradually purchased more than 2,000 tons of lightly processed uranium from Nigeria. The Soviet Union then completed a 10-megawatt nuclear research reactor at Tajura. This marked the beginning of Libya's creation of weapons of mass destruction. Gaddafi also supported several revolutionary movements, including the Black Panther movement, the Nation of Islam, the Irish Republic Army, and many more. Then in April of 1986, a force of British-based US warplanes bombed several sites in Libya, killing and wounding several of his children. The bombs naturally missed Gaddafi himself. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. He began building an unconventional weapons program with the help of the Soviet Union. Some components were also sourced from North Korea and Pakistan. Subsequently, Libya was further sanctioned and cut off from the world. However, Gaddafi's love for his people, the rapid economic developments, as well as the vast oil reserves cushioned Libya from the sanctions. In December 2003, Gaddafi made one big miscalculation, probably the worst of his life though. He stunned much of the world by renouncing Tripoli's weapons of mass destruction programs. Having witnessed Saddam Hussein's Iraq being bombed to the Middle Ages by Bush's government, Gaddafi feared he would be next. He even welcomed international inspectors from the UK and the US to verify that Tripoli would follow through on this commitment. Ultimately, Libya's chemical and nuclear weapons program, as well as its longest ballistic missiles, were completely dismantled. Libya were now breathing with a yoke around their necks. Today, Ukraine would not have been so weak against the Russians if they did not relinquish their WMDs in the 90s, and so was the case of Libya. After normalizing bilateral relations with Washington, the sanctions on Libya were effectively removed, but at what expense? Then fast forward to the 2009, Gaddafi was elected the chairman of the African Union. Later that year, he gave the famous first speech before the UN General Assembly, in which he controversially threw away a copy of the UN Charter. Then came the 2011 Arab Spring, which poured fuel to the fire. In the 2011 Arab Spring, President Zine Ben Ali and Hosni Mubarak resigned from power in the neighboring countries of Tunisia and Egypt. Consequently, anti-Gaddafi demonstrations broke out in the Libyan city of Benghazi, with rebels rising up against his regime. Much of the information reaching the citizens was US-based propaganda. Gaddafi's government attempted to violently suppress the demonstrations. However, the situation degenerated into armed conflicts between the loyalist Gaddafi forces and the rebel militia. Although Western opposition to Gaddafi's actions continued to build, his forces seemed to regain the upper hand in Libya, retaking many of the areas that had been taken by the rebels early in the conflict. And on March 17, 2011, the UN Secretary Council authorized military strikes on Libya. Dubbed Operation Unified Protector, the mass bombings began, dropping civilians like flies. NATO and AFRICOM airstrikes supported the rebels and mercenaries from the Sahel. As mentioned in the previous episode on the Niger coup, AFRICOM is a US military command unit meant to cater for US interests in Africa, which is code for subjugation of African rights. NATO, led by the US, bombed Libya government forces and installation and backed the insurgents' offensive. This was not a humanitarian intervention, but a lengthy, costly, low-tech, regime-changing war, mostly at the expense of the Libyans. Then on April 30th of 2011, a NATO airstrike on Gaddafi's Bab al-Zia compound in Tripoli killed Gaddafi's youngest son, Saif al-Arab, and 3 of Gaddafi's grandchildren reportedly escaped. In August 2011, Gaddafi's hold on power appeared to break when the rebel forces entered Tripoli and took control of most of the areas of the city. As rebel forces solidified their hold on Tripoli, they intensified their efforts to track down Gaddafi, offering a 1.7 million reward for killing or capturing him. Now the writing was on the wall. In October of the same year, Gaddafi's convoy was ambushed by NATO-backed rebel forces in Sirte, his hometown. Sirte is located south of the Gulf of Sirte between Tripoli and Benghazi. After sustaining significant damage from NATO airstrikes led by the French and the UK, Gaddafi sought to escape the besieged city, but his convoy was tracked down and struck. Gaddafi took refuge in a large drainage pipe with several loyalist bodyguards. Amidst chaotic scenes, he was captured alive and shown in various videos before being killed. The exact circumstances of his last breath remains controversial, with some reports suggesting that he was sodomized and executed by rebel fighters. What about Libya's aftermath? Gaddafi's death left an apparent vacuum in Libyan leadership, triggering a power struggle among various rebel factions, something that we see up to today. The absence of a strong central authority paved the way for instability and the ongoing conflict in Libya. Post-Gaddafi Libya descended into chaos, with armed militia vying for control, widespread human rights abuses, and proliferation of weapons across the country. NATO effectively led Libya in ruins, leaving Libyans vulnerable to further unrest and divisions. The intervention in Libya has been a divisive issue in international politics. NATO's role in the demise of Muammar Gaddafi remains a contentious issue. and Libya continues to grapple with the consequences of the conflict, underscoring the importance of a comprehensive post-conflict strategy in such situations. Even today, African intellectuals remember the late Libyan leader as a Pan-African who had the best interests of the continent at heart. Gaddafi was seen as the enemy of the Western countries because of the longing for a United States of Africa, which he pushed for many years, hoping one day to have a unified African government. Peace and love to all Libyans. I'm all out, guys. If you're a Libyan in the house, I would be very much interested in what you think about the ongoing civil war. Feel free to drop your comments and don't forget to subscribe. Kwaheri.